This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
I found it. Look, I love ice cream, but I'm not 18 years old anymore, so I can't eat a lot of it. But I found it. I found a healthy ice cream alternative that actually tastes great. Sweet pea non-dairy ice cream. Get this. It's made with chickpeas. I know, it tastes great. Tastes and feels like real ice cream. Look, I screwed around with soy-based and oat-based products. They all tasted like shit. Sweet pea made from chickpeas is the first healthy alternative I've found that I absolutely love. I'm in DC. I get sweet pea at Giant Foods. If you're in DC, Philly, Pennsylvania, go to Giant Food stores. If you're in New York City, go to Balducci or Key Foods. In San Francisco, go to Nugget. You will absolutely love this. It tastes great. Made with chickpeas. That's so cool. It tastes great.
Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. Listen to this podcast everywhere you listen to podcasts. Apple, Spotify, all of that stuff. Do me a favor. I have a YouTube channel. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Doesn't cost you a thing. White Flag with Joe Walsh on YouTube. Please subscribe. I've said this before, and I'll say it again. I did a hell of a job helping to divide this country. I'm dedicating the rest of my life to trying to do something about that. Hence this podcast. I just love it. Every week I sit down with somebody who doesn't think like me, and I'm excited for this conversation. And Eva, I'm going to introduce you in a second. And I love this issue, and I love to put this issue out there. School shootings are a problem in this country. Should we allow teachers to be armed? I always love this issue. I love talking about it. Every time I tweet about it, it generates a shitload of reaction. And one young lady, the last time I talked about it or tweeted about it, Eva Oliveri, contacted me and let me know where she stood on this issue of should we allow teachers in our schools to be armed. And Eva, I loved what you said to me, and it made me think, doggone it, I want to sit down with her on my podcast and have just a talk about this issue. Eva works in healthcare. She's in school again, working on her second degree in psychology. I find that fascinating. Hey, you were a poli-sci major? By the way, Eva Oliveri, welcome. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
You were a poli-sci major the first time around, correct?
Yes, at a good old University of Central Florida.
So we're going to get into this issue before us. Should we allow teachers to be armed in schools? Before we get to that, because I want to start with understanding. And for everybody listening to us, Eva and I disagree on this topic. I want to understand where originally Eva's belief comes from. But first, Eva, everybody knows who and what I am politically. If I asked you to describe yourself politically, how would you do it?
Definitely progressive. I mean, I identify with the Democratic Party, always voted Democrat. We'll probably always vote Democrat. I know you and I can definitely agree about the current state of the Republican Party.
Yeah.
So yeah, I identify as a Democrat, progressive, but...
Do you like what Joe Biden's doing? Would you like to see someone more progressive than Joe Biden?
I think Joe Biden is doing fantastic. He is the most progressive president we've had in American history. I think that it's very difficult to kind of even get out there everything he's done because there's so much going on in the country. But no, I think Joe Biden's doing fantastic, and I'm excited to vote for him again.
So Eva's a good, genuine, committed progressive. And I am not. So you and I could have such a fun discussion about so many issues.
Absolutely.
But let's focus on this one. And you know where I am. I love the idea of having trained teachers armed in schools. You oppose the idea. Eva, let's start with this. that belief you've got that it would be wrong or a mistake to allow teachers to be armed. Help me understand, like, where does that come from? What kind of began to form that belief for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think when the Sandy Hook shooting happened back in 2012,
Yeah.
I was about 13, going to be, yeah, about to be 13. And that really, I was at the age where, while I was too young to grasp so much nuance, I mean, I was old enough to just be absolutely gutted like the rest of the country.
Yeah.
And I remember watching President Obama speak, and, he got emotional, and then that became a political issue somehow. And I think from that time, I just realized that, I don't think, I'm of the belief personally that more guns don't necessarily make us safer. And as I've grown up and unfortunately continued to hear these things, continue to happen, we have so many guns in this country, and we do have a lot of folks that walk around legally, with
Yeah.
their guns, and that's okay. And I'm not saying that they should not be able to, but that has not made us a safer country. And so I don't believe that will do so in the classroom. And I think that's just kind of always been my train of thought.
It's interesting. So your broader view that more guns generally don't make us more safe. If you applied that sort of view, then applies your thinking on having more guns in schools, kind of.
Exactly. And especially in schools, I feel.
You were not in high school. Help me with this. I think I remember at the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas shooting in Parkland, Florida in 2018. My good friend Fred Gutenberg, who lost his beautiful daughter Jamie. But you were in school, college down there, right? You remember that shooting probably really well.
Yes, I lived in that area for quite some time, maybe 5, 10 minutes from it.
Yeah.
I know one of the parents who lost his son Alex. I'd met him a few times, and just seeing that is so surreal. But I know that area very well, and it love to say close to home, but I mean literally close to home.
Yeah. That did
So I
hit
was
you.
up in
That shooting
Orlando.
did
Yeah,
hit you close to home.
absolutely, absolutely.
What and you know where I am. I'm obviously a big gun guy, a big Second Amendment guy. You and I could have a long discussion on the notion of
Definitely.
more guns, safer, not safer. But on this issue of allowing teachers to be, obviously, hopefully, trained teachers armed. What most concerns you about, say, 15 or 16 trained teachers in some high school who are armed? Like every day in that high school, 15 teachers walking around with a gun. Like, what most concerns you about that?
Yeah, I think on just a day-to-day basis, of course, hoping, praying there's not a need to use that in an active shooter situation, is just gun mishandling,
Yeah.
accidentally leaving it somewhere, kids having access to it, especially in younger children's schools, because we know, unfortunately, school shootings can happen in elementary schools. So, there have been instances of teachers accidentally leaving a firearm unattended in a bathroom, going off. So I think on a day-to-day basis, the thing I'm most worried about is accidental use, misuse, etc., with negative
And
consequences.
and again, someone who disagrees with you on the issue, that's a great point. And that seems to be one of and there's evidence, and you said, Eva, teachers leaving a gun behind in the bathroom is actually the most common example of mishandling. But that, to me, is one of the most powerful arguments against is just teacher mishandling. For everybody listening to us should understand, I think I could be off by a state or two. Right now in America, 33 states allow trained teachers to be armed. Not all states do that, and districts within in the state don't approve. And to Eva's point, and she probably knows this, the vast majority of teachers don't approve of the notion of arming teachers. And I hear that. I hear the notion of guns mishandling. Why? And I think about this a lot, Eva. Why do I so support it? And my assumption, my given is that to arm a teacher in a school, that teacher, like anybody with a gun, any gun owner, has to be properly trained. So as you and I talk about this, that's my assumption too. Like I would never want any adult owning a gun who wasn't properly trained.
Right.
So you've got a properly trained teacher armed in a school. The problem of school shootings is a growing problem in this country.
Absolutely.
I guess, Eva, respond to me. My biggest argument for it is, well, it at least might give some of those kids' lives in that school, in that classroom, when a mass shooter comes in, a fighting chance. Like it might at least give them a fighting chance if an adult were armed. Respond to that.
No, I understand that, and that's why I'm glad we're having this conversation. I respect you because that is the place that you're coming from. I do want to push back a little bit, not on your assumption, because I know that you do not want untrained folks just walking around with guns, but I do want to push back a little bit first in that, unfortunately, a lot of those states don't require a lot of training for teachers.
True.
Ohio just signed a law, I believe, last year that teachers need 24 hours of firearm training. Law enforcement officers need, I believe, 168 is just firearm training, and of course, countless more hours of just regular ongoing training.
Yeah.
So I take your point, and I know that that's what you believe, but unfortunately, that's just not the reality.
Yeah, and to that point, Eva, we're now living, and I'm the biggest gun guy in the world, but we've got now a number of states that are approving, permitless gun purchases where anybody, again, I want people properly trained. And that is a problem. A number of these states vary in the training. But then, and I appreciate that pushback, but then if you had, like if the states met your notion of enough training, wouldn't you feel like, I'm going to ask you my hardest question.
Yeah.
You have a 6-year-old kid in a kindergarten class, and you have a kindergarten teacher who is, as you believe, super duper properly trained. A mass shooter walks into that class. I'm just saying, if it's either or, like I want a teacher in there who's trained and armed or not in my kid's class, boy, I'd rather have that than the other. How do you respond to that?
I mean, you make a very good point, and I think it's the whole notion of training that is difficult because essentially we're asking teachers to play the role of first responders, right? And that's just not what they are there for, unless we essentially make all teachers pretty much become police officers, right, in terms of training. So they're always going to be operating from a lower point than that. And in a high stress situation, which neither you nor I can even imagine, right? A situation where the unthinkable happens. There's a shooter coming in trying to, in your school, in your classroom, to expect that teacher, even if they've had plenty of training, which again will still be less than law enforcement, will not only be able to get their weapon, discharge their weapon, but not accidentally harm a child, especially given your example, little kids, right, who may be running around. It might be absolute chaos. To expect them to be able to then do that and not, God forbid, hit another child or be able to follow through in that moment is just a risk that is too high to take.
That was a beautifully articulate answer, but I love you, and I feel like you avoided my direct question. And so, but I loved what you had to say. But again, here's like it's such an interesting debate, Eva, because like there are so many good arguments against and so many good arguments for.
No, absolutely.
And then like when you put a real life example, like if I had a kid in a class, would I want my teacher, an armed, trained teacher if a mass shooter walked into that class? And all things being equal, oh God, yeah, I would. It
No,
would.
absolutely. And
But
I think that that's a
Would you?
right. And the thing is I think that that is a hard question to answer. I will give you that because in a perfect world, in a way, the answer is yes. But I think that the things that it takes to get to that point and the risk that it involves on the day-to-day basis were that not to happen, right? So the risk of a teacher having a gun in front of these children and that being introduced into the school climate.
Hey, stop
All
there.
of that to me.
Stop there. That's interesting, Eva. That's interesting. I only wanted to stop you there because you made an interesting point. Do you have a problem with what a teacher armed, like a teacher carrying in a school, like how kids might view that? That's interesting. Explain that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I do. And I think it varies by age group. I mean, I think for little ones, for elementary school, I mean, that's traumatizing, right? It's traumatizing and alarming enough for kids when we have trained police officers who, as we know, unfortunately, as we saw lived in Uvalde, do not always respond. But for little ones, it's traumatizing to know, hey, Mr. Smith, they may not even know what a gun is. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But to know that their teacher has essentially a deadly weapon on them, for little kids, I think, is something where they talk now, Republicans love like developmentally appropriate now is the buzzword.
Yeah.
Like, is it developmentally appropriate for a 6-year-old to know and be around a deadly weapon?
Well, I wonder.
I don't know.
That's really interesting because, like, my reaction to that is, well, okay, this is the world as we're living in it right now. So we've got to sit these 6-year-olds down and the 10-year-olds down and explain as lovingly as we can that this is for everybody's protection and your teachers. Again, this is for your good and your protection. And yeah, that would have to be a piece that is explained. But even like, and I hear you that, the teacher's got to grab the gun and it could misfire and one of the kids could get hit and all of that. And all of that's a given in any mass shooter situation. They're chaotic. But even with all of that, to me, you still have a better fighting chance if there is an adult there protecting the kids with a gun or not, than not. In a real life situation.
Right, right. I mean, I think to be completely honest, and this is a whole separate issue that we will never see eye to eye on, is AR-15s, right? Those high-powered guns.
Don't you go there.
But those high-powered guns, the truth is, love them or hate them, that they fire and are in such a way where even the most trained law enforcement with their handguns cannot always react on time, which is why, unfortunately, and not why in a valid way, but why that we have seen law enforcement who just don't go in, run away, because they are afraid of that weapon. So
okay, but then I will always push back on you
yeah,
with respect.
go ahead.
Agreed.
Absolutely.
The guy walks into a classroom with an AR-15, and you and I will never agree on AR-15s, but that's fine. But the shooter walks in with an AR-15. Same question. I know, man, it's more powerful than the handgun the teacher would have. But even with that, that's your child in that classroom. Somebody walks in with an AR-15. Do you want your teacher properly trained to have a handgun or not? Your kid's teacher.
I mean, I still say no because I think that there are so many ways that we can avoid that being the situation that it's not really a fair.
Stop. I love you. And then you can jump on me. I agree. There are a lot of things we need to do to avoid that situation. Totally agree, Eva. But let's say it's unavoidable, as many of these are, and it's here. And that guy is in the classroom or in the hallway with an AR-15. Do you want an adult trained with a handgun in that vicinity or not?
No, because I think it's introducing, honestly, the more danger. I don't think that adult is going to be able to do anything, even with their training. And I think that there's a possibility for, collateral damage. And actually, I didn't know this before coming on here and actually researching, so this isn't like something that I walked around knowing. But the Association of School Resource Officers oppose arming teachers.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
oppose it because for the points I mentioned, because it's dangerous for law enforcement as well. I mean, if law enforcement does their job, which is coming in guns blazing, right? And let's say there is a teacher who has their weapon out, maybe even tried to discharge it and, harm the shooter. Maybe they did or didn't. They're the one with the gun out. The teachers don't know what's going on. That teacher could so easily be shot by the police.
So the two biggest arguments against my position you've raised, and you've raised really well. One is the mishandling of guns.
Yes, that's a big one.
That's a big one.
Day-to-day.
I think that's your biggest one, actually. But you raised the second one, which is a truth in any shooting situation. Even like if I'm walking down the street and I carry and I see a bad guy shooting people, as a legal law-abiding gun owner, I'm going to try to save lives. But you make a good point. When cops come on a situation, who's the good guy, who's the bad guy, that's a real issue as well.
Right.
And that's, I think, the other interesting objection to arming teachers is, okay, there's a mass shooting in a school, a teacher fires against the mass shooter, 8-10 minutes, the cops come. It's not super uncommon that the cops right away making split decisions wouldn't know. I think that's the second most powerful.
Teachers shouldn't have to be martyrs. They shouldn't have to be martyrs for their kids.
And I'd say, like, Eva, like, it's not a surprise to me that most teachers would oppose this. I think if you polled most public school teachers, they're probably not real big on guns anyways. And resource center folks, resource officers probably as well. And I'll acknowledge, to your point, that we ask so much of teachers, teach our kids to teach our kids and protect them.
Exactly.
I would never advocate ever forcing any adult or teacher in a school to be armed and trained. I'm an advocate of teachers voluntarily doing this if they want. So I agree with that. The other thing that jumped out at me, respond to this, is in most school shootings, not all, but most, the evidence shows that when confronted by another armed person, typically the mass shooter kills himself.
Yes.
Not in all, but in most.
Right. No, that's absolutely correct.
And I think, again, like having an armed adult in the school, I think confronting, even if they can't outshoot a mass shooter with an AR-15, just the evidence that just confronting that shooter, the shooters then typically kill themselves. I think that's a really good reason.
I mean, that is a good point. That is true. Yes, most mass shooters do that. They don't really care about their own lives. But again, I would venture to say that the likelihood of all of those things aligning, right? Now, again, the teacher having the gun, would they carry it? So I still am hesitant, and I still don't think so, because I think so much would have to align.
And I would want, if a teacher volunteered to be armed in a school, properly trained.
Right. How do you picture properly trained? I'm generally like,
say what?
Like if Joe Walsh could make armed teacher policies uniform, what would they look like? I'm very curious.
Well, to me, it would be a really good, rigorous, basic training that anyone who wants to own and carry a gun should undergo. And then obviously regular ongoing training, as much as a law enforcement officer should have to go through. No, I wouldn't recommend or want that for average citizens. Like, I don't want to have to go through that as a guy who carries guns. So I'd really want teachers. And because Eva, like, and maybe I'm wrong, like if I were president of America tomorrow and I said, okay, teachers, anybody who wants to be armed can be armed. Here's the training that you have to go through. Go to it, anybody. So anybody then who agreed to that training and then got themselves trained and stayed trained, more power to them. But yeah, I would, to your point, it would be the same level of training that anybody who wants to carry a gun and keep that carry ability should undergo.
Right. And the problem is that, like you mentioned before, that means so many different things in so many states. I mean,
Yes.
in some states that means actually rigorous training. In Florida, that essentially means nothing, you know? So I think that, and again, I still oppose it, but even if we were looking at like, okay, it were to be done, how is it done right? The way that the patchwork of carry laws, gun laws, permitless carry is now, red flag laws, which I know you and Fred Gutenberg agree on and both believe should be implemented widely, that isn't. So I think that even with, a perfect world, training, the best of intentions, how do you implement that
Well, this is
in
interesting.
the state?
Yeah, this is interesting, Eva, because this has always bugged me, and maybe you disagree with me. I revere the Second Amendment as much as I do the First Amendment, and to me, it's there in the federal Constitution. So the whole notion of states coming up with different whatevers has always bothered me. So I'd actually support a more federal uniform kind of criteria for arming teachers because I think it's a federal right. It bothers me, Eva, that like when I drive to certain states, all of a sudden I may lose that right. Like if I move or drive through a certain state, like I can carry in Virginia and not carry in Maryland. Well, hold on a minute. Like I have free speech. I have the same free speech in Virginia or Maryland. So I think you and I might actually meet somewhere there on the common ground in that I'm bothered by the state by state variance.
Right. We're probably bothered for different reasons.
Yes, we are.
But yes. But yes, no, absolutely. And when you're talking about something like arming teachers, which again, while I do oppose, if part of, I think, a discussion, what's great about this discussion is, yes, I oppose it, you support it, but I like to think about, okay, you support it, what would it look like in your mind, because that's a big part of it. So even if you could convince me that it is something to support, it's just not practical from a putting away all of, everything we've spoken about. Like, it's just not practical to implement, even if, I was on board, you were on board. It's state by state, the way it works. It's just not, you know more than anyone, the NRA, right? Even though they're all pro-arming teachers, the moment training is required or red flag laws, right, or deep background checks, then all of a sudden they're not for it, right? There's so many bad actors when it comes to
Yes.
anything to
Yes.
do with any kind of gun, not even restriction, but filter,
Yes.
I guess is the better word.
And yes, you're correct. In fact, it has been implemented in 33 states to varying degrees of training and to varying degrees of usage. And I will fully acknowledge that most teachers and most school officials in this country are much more on your side because even in the schools that allow, in the states that allow it, the vast majority of teachers are not even thinking about doing it. Even, it's interesting, Eva, even teachers who are concealed carry owners and they've gone through some training, most of those teachers don't want to be armed in school. So my view is definitely the minority view here. I acknowledge that. But it is, so it's there, but a lot of teachers aren't
Right.
taking advantage of it.
Yeah. And I think, the whole, the notion in general, right, of a good guy with a gun. I'm not advocating for taking away people's handguns, but I think that general notion is, while well intended, at least from when you say it, I believe it's genuine. I don't know, sometimes when like the NRA says it, I don't really think they care. But I know when you say it, you genuinely believe and mean it. That I think it's a good thought, right? Like it is at least coming from you, I think a genuine thought.
Like this,
but
Eva.
Again,
Like this, Eva. And you and I are going to meet one day. You and I are out having a cup of coffee somewhere at your favorite coffee shop. I would much rather be carrying than if like a bad guy walked into that coffee shop, and I would rather, because I consider myself a good guy with a gun, I would do
Yeah.
whatever I could to protect your life. So I do believe in that, but I know it
Yeah.
can
No,
be
I mean, my
abused.
mom carries. Hi,
Love
mom.
your mom.
She
Eva, I
wanted to
love
shout
your
out.
mom.
She carries. She, if anything, she's actually she agrees with you on this particular issue. Actually, so she carries. I have no problem with her doing that when I visit her. She carries, and she feels the same way. She would rather be carrying than not in that situation, and I think she should be able to. I think you should be able to. It is just not for me, right? And you're not. And neither
But
of you guys are
yet,
telling me, hey, I should.
but
But
yet, for different reasons, and I appreciate that, Eva, but for different reasons, if I were a teacher, as much as you like me, you would not want me to be able to carry in my school classroom.
right, because I think there's so that you're introducing so many other variables, right? You are charged with all these other lives that are actually your responsibility at that point, right? They could be
That's
you.
fascinating. I love the way you said that. Yes, I'm charged with other lives, so I would want to do all I can to protect those lives.
And I believe that. I just don't think that you carrying a gun will achieve that end. I don't. That is really the core of it. Is I 100% believe. I mean, teachers, unfortunately, as we know, I mean, genuinely die for their children in these shootings sometimes. So it's not that I don't think a teacher would absolutely do everything they could, including if they were carrying. I just don't think it will achieve that
You
end.
don't, do you think it could have any positive impact if implemented in a way that met all kinds of criteria that you approved of? Could it have any impact in a
I mean, I
positive way?
think I think it would be in bad faith for me to say it never would because I just don't know. But I do know that generally, in situations where there were folks who were armed, be they sworn law enforcement. I mean, they were at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We all know they were at Uvalde. There are these situations where there are armed law enforcement who again, we both agree, have significantly more firearms training than a teacher would, even a teacher who voluntarily chooses to carry. And, it does not always end up doing anything. So I can't say for sure no because we haven't lived that. You know what I mean? So it wouldn't be fair for me to say absolutely no, but I don't think so.
So
Especially, oh,
keep
go
going.
ahead.
No, I was going to say, and it comes back to what I think is your strongest argument, one of your strongest arguments, which is the mishandling of guns. Even the most properly trained adults like me can make mistakes, leave a gun behind
Absolutely.
somewhere. That's a real concern. I balance that with the fact that there is evidence in some of the stuff I've read that going back the last 20 years, there's been 18 some incidents where an armed adult in a school stopped a shooter. So there have been examples of this happening. And Eva, I'm just always so stuck on, and I'm fascinated by this. It would at least give my kid a fighting chance. I'm always stuck there. Like,
Yeah, no, I mean, and I honestly, I don't necessarily have a objective pushback to that. Otherwise, I think that the other 364 days of the year where that didn't happen, it may put your child in more danger because they're around deadly weapons. Again, I think it varies. I think in high schools, there's an issue of not just mishandling or leaving it behind, but heck, a teacher leaving a gun and a student taking it and then using it on themselves, using it on other students. So if anything, the older the children get, I mean, unfortunately, we know the perpetrators of these crimes are usually young white men, but not too far from the high school age or in that age range. It could even be a situation where that shooting may not have happened if that student didn't happen upon a gun that was either left behind or taken from an armed teacher. Would they be carrying it? Would they have it in a locker in their desk? Like, it's
you don't, Eva, you don't, and obviously you know how strong I am on this issue. You don't like, where are you on guns? You don't oppose necessarily.
No, I don't like the word oppose guns because they're here.
Yeah.
They're here to stay. Like, we have enough guns in this country for everyone like 3 times over.
Yeah.
I do not believe that AR-15 should be out here in circulation. I know you and I will never agree on that.
Yeah.
I believe that there should be universal background checks, federal background checks. There should be red flag laws. A lot of things that are common sense. That, again, you and Fred Gutenberg, I love your conversations.
Yeah.
You guys do find common ground. And that is the most basic of things that I think I want. So I don't love the idea. Personally, I'm choosing not to. I probably would never own a gun. I don't really have interest in firing a gun.
Yeah.
But I know they're here. I'm not suggesting that, and I know you don't think I am, but some folks would think that folks like me are suggesting going door to door and, taking everyone's guns. That's not it. But because they're here, they need to be regulated a lot more than they are.
And you and I would, and that, to me, that's how the political process would work. You and I would debate, argue, and fight over the amount of regulation.
Right.
I think it would bolster school safety, and I think you and I would agree on this. It's certainly not, arming teachers would certainly not be the be-all, end-all. It's not the only solution. To me, it's just an add-on. Like you mentioned earlier, we should never even get to that situation where a mass shooter walks into my kid's class. Agreed, we shouldn't, but we do.
But you will, right? We will. No, absolutely.
So to me, this is like, I've always looked at this issue as like a final layer of security if everything else is breached. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. And I'm certainly not going to say no, that situation would never happen, because it happens again and again and again. So yeah, no, that's not, I agree. That's certainly, even if I were to support that, not the first line of defense. But again, I think that, there's so much I think we should do. Again, I do not think that these high-powered weapons should be...
Stop. Would you stop saying that?
No.
I know you won't. Hey, but Eva, what if a teacher came to you and said, and look, I go through gobs of training. I'm super effective and trained with a gun. Eva, I want to volunteer. I'd like to carry in my school to protect the kids in my school. What would you say to that teacher?
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I don't want it to sound, and hopefully nothing I said gave that impression, that I doubt the genuineness of that or the intent behind that. But again, a teacher can be trained and trained and trained, but they will never have the kind of training that law enforcement does, where they're put in those high pressure situations. They could have the best of intentions, and I believe most do, but until they are in that situation, they cannot guarantee that they will be able to help or even be able to not make it worse.
Well, and that's a good point, Eva, but that all of us civilians who carry and went through the process to get trained to carry, none of us will have the training that law enforcement
has. Oh, of course.
Oh, no,
I know.
So it's, and many of us will be put into those crazy situations. No doubt. But to me, that's a given.
Yes. But it kind of goes back to what we said before, where absolutely that's a given, but I'm not, again, love or hate guns, I'm not going to police, for lack of a better term, civilians who can carry, done what you have to do in your state, you can carry, right? That is what it is. I think that, again, in some states, you shouldn't just be able to be like, hey, I want a gun. Okay, cool, here's this deadly weapon. Like, things like permitless carry, I think, make us all more unsafe. But yes, when you're doing your thing, you're a civilian, you have your permit, you're carrying, that's fine. I can't do anything about that, right? Not my thing, not something I want to do, but I cannot do anything about that. But when it's in a contained environment like a school, I think, again, that is different. It is a contained environment where, like I said, there are so many other variables that are all around it. It's not just you.
Is it a contained environment? Like, again, you and I are at a coffee shop and some bad guy walks in and I use my gun to try to save people's lives. That's a contained environment. Most of these things happen in contained environments, but maybe the point you're making is a school, because of the children, is a very uniquely contained.
Yes.
Is that kind of where you're going?
Absolutely. Yes. And again, assuming all else goes well, like there's no mishandling, no accidents, problems, discharges, etc. And again, even in that moment, the teacher is somehow, which again I doubt, but able to get their weapon, try to discharge it. It's
Well, I'm saying, Eva, I'm saying able to get their weapon. I'm saying they're carrying their weapon.
Right. So I mean, able to get it out in that situation, utilize
got
it.
it. Okay.
It's a danger to the teachers too, right? If all that were to go, I hate to say as planned, but if that situation were to occur and that were all to go as we hope, that teacher could still get shot by law enforcement because law enforcement doesn't know what's going on. I mean, and at that point you can't blame them, right? If law enforcement does their job, they are running in there. They're not Uvaldeing, they're not sitting there. And I know you know that, right? If they're doing their job, they are on that and they are eliminating whoever they think is the person.
But yes, true. But if cops are doing their job, and this is one of the reasons I feel so strongly about this. If a mass shooter's in a hallway, in a classroom, even the cops doing their job, they're not going to be there for a certain amount of time. Even if they're hustling and scrambling, they're not going to be there. So you've got 2 minutes, 4 minutes, 8 minutes, whatever, 10 minutes before a cop is there. So that's why it's the last line of defense before a cop can get there. And you make a good point, Uvalde. I'm still fucking pissed off about Uvalde.
It's
and the security guy down at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas who just got
Peterson,
off.
I think. Yeah, no, absolutely. So no, exactly, and
But
I think that.
But I agree. But in most cases, and again, mistakes are made, but in most cases, then when cops come on the scene, not a school, but generally just a mass shooting or a shooting where there was a good guy with a bad gun, with a good guy with a gun and a bad guy with a gun, in most of those cases, the cops are able to react properly. There are some cases, I agree, where, again, in the heat of the moment, mistakes are made.
Yeah, and I think
that's
that,
not typical, but there are. I agree that.
No, I mean, in high pressure situations, trained law enforcement does not always hit their target. Like, not that they necessarily even have the wrong target, just in those situations. And I also think it's just a matter of not just everything having to go, all these things having to align for the teacher to be able to use the weapon, but then hoping at the end that even if they were to do it and they were to somehow, which again I don't believe that this would be the norm, but they were able to stop the shooter or something like that. Do we then want, even in some situations, teachers who were then heroes being killed by law enforcement, or an exchange of fire between a teacher and law enforcement? So even if everything else were to go perfectly, quote unquote, in that situation, there's still that additional risk.
Well,
that is.
Yeah, no, I know, but if a properly trained teacher volunteered to carry, just like in life, when I carry in life, I know that's a risk I'm taking if I ever have to use my gun for a good reason. I know that's a risk I'm taking when law enforcement might arrive on the scene. Any teacher would understand that risk. But then I always come back to this, Eva. The vast majority of school shooters, when even just confronted with an adult with a gun, pretty immediately just kill themselves. So I think that's
which is why they usually never enter the classroom anyway.
Huh?
They usually don't. They don't always even enter the classroom.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so no, absolutely,
Anywhere
and I do agree with that. But I think that, and putting aside the, like you said, I cannot even still wrap my head around Uvalde and all of the law enforcement, quote unquote. But that's the thing, is like, you have to think about, like, obviously, I think they're all horrific excuses for human beings. But do you wonder, like, did they didn't necessarily wake up with that day thinking, oh, like, I'm going to not react to a school shooter. But in that moment, those people who volunteered, as in they're police officers, right? They chose that profession. They chose that that is what they are charged to do, did not act because of
But
fear or
yes,
cowardice. How do we know a teacher who
yeah,
is not trained to
yes.
that degree?
But would you acknowledge, my dear, that what those cops did in Uvalde was the exception, not the rule?
Yeah.
And
Oh,
that's why it
yes,
was
yes.
so egregious and outrageous.
No,
Because,
yeah, no,
yeah,
I do agree. I'm just saying that if law enforcement is either not going to be able to stop fast enough, or in that instance not try, we don't know how a teacher could again volunteer with the best of intentions, and but the moment happens and suddenly, oh shit, right? They may
yes.
not react how they thought they would.
And the oh shits are, again, even in active shooter situations and cops arrive on the scene, the oh shit, I shot the wrong guy or whatever, that is the rare exception. I'm not going to say it doesn't happen. It does, but it's the rare exception. Eva, and you're younger than I am. You're young. You got your whole life. I'm an old fart. This is look, I acknowledge this is the world we live in now. We have a shitload of guns. That's not going to change. We have to do a better job in this country of keeping guns out of the hands of people who shouldn't have them. But this is our world now. We have mass shootings. We have shootings in schools. I want your viewpoint on this. Shouldn't we have kind of a culture change with our kids in schools? And shouldn't we kind of embrace, I don't mean that positively, but acknowledge this reality and tell our kids, you know, this is the world now, and we're going to do all we can to keep you safe. And it's still very uncommon that you'll be in a school where there's a school shooting. It's still off the charts uncommon, but these things happen. We're going to do all we can. And part of what we're going to do now is properly trained adults in this school are going to be armed to protect you. Couldn't we go through kind of a sea change and educate kids on that? And maybe they'd be more accepting of one of your legitimate concerns, which is children seeing armed teachers.
Well, I mean, I think that we're already, I wouldn't say culture change, because we're already traumatizing a generation with all the lockdown drills we have to do. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do lockdown drills, but I think that it's sort of not pessimistic, but I agree that unfortunately this is how it is, in that children need to be prepared, but they are, because they live it, right? They are the generation that starts learning lockdown drills when they're 6. They are the generation that grows up with this. So I think it's twofold, because I'm not going to sit back, and I know this isn't what you're necessarily saying, and be like, this is how it is, you know, darn. Like, there are certainly groups like the NRA that want that. And I think so, to a certain extent. I think sitting down on one hand and just culturally changing, being like, this is how it is.
Oh,
This
no, what
is
I meant, Eva, tell me, respond to this. Like, and I agree with you. Kids are already traumatized by this. So I want to say, fuck it now. Let's show kids that we're really doing something about it. And here's one of the things we're going to do about it to protect you. Let's start going on the offense to get over this fear that children may have when there's a good adult in a school armed to protect them.
I don't know that that's the kind of fear that is gotten over. I think it's just a broader statement on the constant onslaught of, like, that this could happen to them. But I also think that we should continue to fight for, both acknowledge that this does happen far too frequently, but also continue, at least for myself, continue to advocate for not accepting that as the norm, trying to get leaders to actually do something beyond just thoughts and prayers on, you know, replay 100 times over. You know, we are the only country in the world where this happens. You and I may disagree as to why, but
No,
that
I
is a
think,
fact.
and weirdly, I think we'd agree as to why. I acknowledge as to why. We have a shitload of guns, and we have
Right.
a crazy gun culture. And I say that as a gun guy. No doubt, no doubt. What? Because I think you and I agree that arming teachers is not the only thing we could or should do.
Absolutely.
And Eva, focused just on schools, and don't you dare go after my AR-15s again, but just focused on schools, what other things should we be doing to make schools safer?
It's hard to silo it just to schools because I think that making schools safer, well, it still starts with universal background checks. It still starts with someone not being able to buy.
Agreed. But in a country like this with so many guns, and even if you outlawed and banned AR-15s tomorrow, there are 60 million of them in the country. Some guy could still walk into a school with an AR-15, even with all your best gun control laws. So is there anything we can do to better safeguard schools, to better safeguard those environments? Security measures in the school. Do you not like or like a security guard on campus? Does that matter?
I mean, I think at this point and I don't know if this breaks, I would say maybe from the progressive side. I mean, I'm of the belief at this point that anything we can do. So yes, if it's between arming teachers or an armed officer or security guard, I'll take the armed officer or security guard. Ultimately, I don't know how much that does or does not do.
You are so funny because I'd take both. Like if you said I could have an armed security guard and I could have teachers in that school who wanted to volunteer to carry and they're trained, give me it all. Give me it all.
I mean, I don't even know, honestly, like I said, how much the armed security officer would even do. But yes. I do think that things like, and this is not, again, the only answer. So I hate when this is given as the only answer.
What?
But I do think like stronger security measures in the school in terms of, bulletproof glass, things like that. And again, I don't like it. I actually hate it. And I think there is so much outside of the physical school building that needs to change, like things like background checks, red flag laws, raising the age to purchase these kinds of weapons. But if we're talking about just the literal physical school grounds, I'm not going to say no to that, right? Like
you're so funny.
That should be something.
It
just is not the thing.
You are so funny. And I find that so curious because I agree with you, but I think, and let me speak for you and then you can yell at me, but I think it bugs you, it bothers you that you have to say, okay, glass or gun-proof the glass, lock down the schools, build a metal wall around everything. It bothers you that you might have to physically secure that environment because then you're almost acknowledging that we're doing a shitty job outside the school, and here it comes. Wait, I can't hear you. Eva. Save that thought. Don't you dare go. You
better?
There. Now.
Oh, okay. Now,
No, right there. So, answer that. Am I right?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. You're right. Because it pisses me the fuck off, honestly.
I knew it.
That this is the world we live in. Because you're right. It forces us to be like, yeah, this is just something that happens, kids getting slaughtered in school, so we should probably, make the glass bulletproof and such. And we should. But the fact that, and what pisses me, and I know that you have no love lost for the NRA at this point,
hate them.
But what pisses me off the most of them, aside from literally everything they do, which to me is just gross and offensive, is that they love that. They love saying that. It gets them hyped up to be like, yeah, bulletproof glass, the schools, rah, rah. Meanwhile, they are there at every freaking turn. Every
Eva.
turn.
Preach, girl, preach.
Trying to stop even the most basic of not even gun control.
I find, and again, I love you, and I love that you're so fucking honest because I get it, and I kind of feel the same way, even though we disagree on the issue. You're so pissed at the NRA and other people who don't want to do these other things that we have to bulletproof a school building.
Right, absolutely, because for another favorite of ours, Ted Cruz, right? Everyone understandably was dragging him because he went on Fox News and was like, we should lock doors. Well, yes, Ted, no one is saying that we should prop doors open and be like, guns welcome. But that is all he wants, right? He's going for nothing else.
It's a deflection for many
Absolutely.
people on the right. I acknowledge that. But my favorite young person on the left is your view on not wanting to arm teachers then the same as bulletproofing the building? Like, are you so pissed off about all this other stuff and Ted Cruz and the right aren't doing anything on guns that they should do? Now we're at a point where we have to fucking talk about arming teachers. That pisses me off.
No, I mean, yes and no. I'm not going to say it doesn't piss me off.
It's both.
But bulletproof glass on the day-to-day does not pose an active threat to other students.
It's both.
Very good automatic door locks can't be left in the bathroom and a student could accidentally fire it and hurt themselves or someone else. So yes and no, of course that pisses me off, but also things like physically, hardening schools or hard targeting, whatever you want to call it, doesn't pose any, there's no real drawback aside from we were talking about psychological drawback. That's a whole other thing.
Eva, that's a good fucking answer. I hear you. That's a really good answer. I appreciate that answer. I'm going to close with two questions. One isn't a question. I'm going to ask us each to do something, and I'm going to start. We've had one issue. You and I like and respect each other. We disagree on this issue. I want to ask you what you think my strongest argument was, and I'm going to say what I think yours is, and I'll start. I think your strongest argument is guns being mishandled, i.e. the teacher forgetting the gun in the bathroom. I think your second strongest argument is putting a teacher's life at risk, the armed teacher, when law enforcement arrives. And then you said something, your third argument, Eva, that I really honestly didn't give much thought to is, and I disagree with this, but I think it's a strong argument, what it would do to kids having to see teachers armed. I disagree with that, but that's a really strong argument. So I'd say I found those three your most powerful. Did I have any one that was kind of good?
Yeah, no, I mean, no, yes. And honestly, I think that simple question of if it was your child in the classroom, would you want a trained armed teacher? Because it's difficult to say no to that because you would do anything for your child, right? You would do anything for your child in the world. I mean, you could say the most ridiculous thing, and if you think that it would even move the needle in
yes.
tiny amount, you would say yes. But I just don't think everything else we went over outweighs that. But I think that is just it's a strong argument because the answer is always yes to anything that you think. People will do anything as they should for their children. It could be the most unlikely thing, but if it could do even a tiny bit, a possibility of it, of course the answer is yes. So while it didn't change my mind, that is a strong argument because I also know that that's the lens through which you're making the argument is because you genuinely want to solve this problem and, find common ground as to how we can.
And I think my other strongest argument that you kind of thought was a good argument was the evidence that most school shooters will shoot themselves when confronted by an adult with a gun. Hey, Joe Biden puts you and I in a room for a weekend. Like President Biden calls you and me to the White House. And he puts us in a room and he says, Eva, Joe, I'm going to give you guys the weekend. I'm going to make a speech about whether we should arm, what our policy should be on arming teachers or not. You two find some common ground. Fine. If you and I were locked away in the White House for a weekend, I wonder if we could find any common ground on this issue. What's your thought on this specific issue? I don't know that we could.
Right. It's difficult because one of us, either I'd have to say, okay, we arm teachers, here's where we agree it should be, or if it's no, we don't, then what you and I agree with in terms of other measures. So I think if Joe Biden was like, hey, we're going to arm teachers,
yeah.
And what do you agree on within that? We would both agree that there has to be more training than 12 24 hours or just like, hey, I think I should have a gun and bring it to school. It shouldn't be compulsory. So I think within, if we had to choose a side, we could probably agree, right? So if it was like we had to, we could agree on things. And if he's like, sorry, we won't, then you and I could probably agree about some school security measures.
Yeah, I agree.
So
that's a good
if
answer.
we were given a side and then had to find common ground, we probably could. But if it's a black and white, yes or no.
No, and I think you're right. I think, you would be in an unfair position because I would never support not arming teachers if they're properly trained. You'd have to be convinced, you'd have to say, okay, Joe and President Biden will do it, but I want this amount of training.
Right.
That's the only way I'll consider it. And then me and Joe Biden, well, Joe Biden would be on your side, but me and a Republican president then would have to agree to your level of, rigorous
exactly.
ass
So
training.
right, which absolutely, yeah. So it would be, but there's still something there, and I think and again, at least there are good intentions. That's what so many of this is missing. Is again like anyone. Conservatives, the right, Republicans. I know it's not what you are at this point, but there's no care there. Like, you know what I mean? Like when Ted Cruz sends his copy and pasted thoughts and prayers, he may advocate for arming teachers, but I don't think it's really because he gives a shit at this point.
Eva,
I think it's just because he has to toe the NRA company line.
Eva, that's such a low blow, cheap shot to do at the end of this conversation, to bring up a guy I can't stand like Ted Cruz. That's not fair that you did that, because I can't and won't defend him. Darn you. Hey, this was fun. Thank you. And I mean this. You know how adamant I am on this issue, but you made me think. I never thought of the issue of how kids would react really to arming teachers. And I really appreciate that. And I'm going to think about that. But thank you mostly, Eva, for having this conversation and doing it in a fun, respectful way and listening. We both listened to each other. This is what we need to do more of.
100%. You
rock. And by the way, if anybody wants to follow Eva on Twitter, we're not going to call it X, it's Twitter. She's at Eva Brooke _26. Eva, BROOKE _26. Eva, you rock, kiddo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.